Well, welcome back to another exciting episode of Speak Easy.
Tonight we're delighted to have with us Dr. Linda Kirkman, who will be engaging in the hot topic of LGBTI plus sexual education and health. Linda is a sex therapist, a counsellor, sexual educator and researcher, as well as the current Victorian President of the Society of Australian Sexologists. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
We're really happy to have you.
And let's just dive right in. Queer sex and
I'm in favour.
and health education in Australian schools. Some say it's lacking. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, it's lacking. So much of sex education and sexuality education, particularly in schools, is framed around what's safe. And it's almost like it's something that won't scare the parents rather than what's going to be really useful for the students. In many school communities, there's a very much a heteronormative, conservative attitude. It's really useful information for most people, but it leaves out the people who may be really desperate to see themselves or find themselves or looking for answers and have no idea where to go.
And I would imagine some of that kind of sex education comes from conversations at home with parents and siblings. And if you are part of the queer community, your parents and your family may not be able to provide the kind of advice and education that you need.
The ideal response to someone in that, if you're the parent, in that situation will be to say, you know, that's a really good question. I don't know the answers. Let's work out how we can find out the answer to that question. I'll help you find some resources.
It'd be nice if all families were like that.
Yeah.
It would be awesome if all families were like that.
So why don't we explore that? What is queer sex? What is sex for the dynamic of people who are trans, people who are lesbian, people who are gay? Like, it differs so much from heteronormative sex.
That's a really good question. I just want to, for the benefit of your audience, should I define heteronormative? Because that's a word I use a lot. Heteronormativity is a belief or a system, a theory that says gender is binary, male and female, that sexuality is all heterosexual, that sex is penis in vagina sex, and it's intended for reproduction. We live in a really heteronormative culture. It is the dominant social expectation, cultural expectation. I wish the local paper would stop having babies in pink and blue when say who's been born. I've got a friend who's an obstetrician who, when someone says, is it a boy or a girl, they'll say, probably. Which I think is a great answer.
I love that.
Yeah. What is queer sex and what might queer sex education look like? It's about the importance of first knowing yourself and understanding that who you are today might be really different from who you are next year, 5 years ago, or in 10 years' time, and that what is sexuality and sex for you, it can be really fluid, can change over the course of a day. Because of the heteronormative expectation, a lot of people go into their sexual activity assuming that they will live a hetero life because that's what the world expects. And unless you're really, really passionately, powerfully convinced that you are something outside that, and unless you honour that, you'll just burst, then people can kind of drift into living a heteronormative sexual life and not even think to explore more widely. With the queer community, but applies to anybody who's exploring pleasure in themselves and their sexuality. Know yourself. Have some fun exploring different kinds of touch and toys all over your body. It doesn't have to just to be genital stuff. Know what feels good to you. Know where you just do not want to be touched, and so that you at least can communicate to a partner.
People who explore with sex other than penis in vagina don't necessarily have to define themselves as queer. You can identify as heteronormative and have exploration in the bedroom without having to call yourself queer or gay or whatever because of the type of sex that you're having. because somebody can be identify as heterosexual
and totally
be
pass.
attracted to the opposite sex,
Yeah.
but still explore all kinds of sexual activities in the bedroom.
Or just a heterosexual couple that plays up their gender roles and mixes, do you know?
And play, and
just
has some plays and all kinds of different plays. Yes. And if people feel inhibited by feeling like they have to conform and fit in that little box, and maybe their anal sphincter is really sensitive and it's a part they really love having touched, but that's butt play. Does that make me gay? Then it's really sad for those people, because there's a whole stress that goes along with pleasure, rather than just thinking I have this amazing body with nerve endings and all sorts of places, and let's just enjoy those nerve endings, and that's cool. The sexual trichotomy, so it's like how you self-identify, how you identify publicly, and your behaviours, and they can be all aligned or they can be totally different. There can be any combination of that, and that's really a really common thing for people not necessarily to be all aligned in that way. I wanted to talk about, though, sometimes they're separate and sometimes they're together, whether you're doing sexual activity because you're horny and you want to get off, or whether you're seeking intimacy and you've been taught, and intimacy is a really lovely way to have naked and skin contact and just together, and maybe some sort of pleasure, but it's about that connection rather than about the getting off. And sometimes the expectation is that, well, they'll be both happening all at the same time, and it always has to be all happening at the same time, or never happening at the same time. Like, there are no rules, well,
other than consent.
Obey the law, and yes, which would include definitely consent. You can have a lot of fun with a body that's yours or somebody else's and playing.
So Linda, can you tell us a couple of key aspects of consent education?
Yeah, so much of the way consent education has been framed is consent is framed about prevention of violence. And prevention of violence really matters. But another aspect of consent education that's really important is consent as it's framed around your experience of pleasure. So it's that ongoing, if you're having a physical interaction with another person, that ongoing feedback about, oh, that's good, or a little bit to the left, oh, stop right there, I've got a cramp. Well, so that the consent education it's not just you sign off at the start of a session. It's this ongoing conversation that's a shared thing, and it's fundamentally based on respect for one another and equity in the power of consent. To follow up around the idea of power and consent, so much of how we're socialised suggests that there will be a dominant, not always, but usually masculine person in a dynamic that's sexual, and that what they want is more likely is what goes. So to really, and particularly if you're talking about queer relationships, and trying to work out, well, what do we do between you to a queer relationship where you're not a gender binary opposite sex couple? Well, what is it that we do, and who does what to whom, and who has the power, and how do we negotiate that? The social context is it's a new field from my understanding, and that's something that's probably why it's really important to know who you are and what you want, and also to be able to spend some time sussing out, what are we going to do, and what do we like, and what are you into and what are you not into.
So when you taught sexual health in high school, I know you brought elements of LGBT into your curriculum. Would you like to tell us about that and tell us about queer sex education in schools?
I was really proud of the sex ed curriculum that I wrote with some useful resources, but I fundamentally wrote it. I was a pioneer in my own way, for lots of reasons. I started out with communication skills and conflict resolution. I certainly was really inclusive of the whole alphabet. Got into trouble for talking about trans as a thing.
Resistance for trans education, where was that coming
The
from?
principal called me up and said that someone had complained, and I thought, what did I say? I worked out later that I had made a reference to Jan Morris's book, Conundrum, because I'd just been reading it and I was just, trans is a thing, you know, wow, that's interesting. I don't think I spent a lot of time on it in class, but that was enough. But that was the same principal who said, when he heard that I was comparing in the mid-80s HIV to bubonic plague and doing a history of plagues, he called me up and said, you can talk about AIDS so long as you don't mention condoms. So, yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
Wow.
Well, no, but teaching is a subversive activity, so I organised for my GP to come and give a talk, and she talked about condoms.
Yeah. What years was this that you were teaching?
This was year 8, so they would have been 13-year-olds, 13, 14-year-olds, and what was really awesome was that it was a whole semester, 5 classes a fortnight. So it wasn't just like a one-off thing, you could actually take the time to explore. I know that I did spend a lot of time on STIs, and that's often a criticism of sexuality education, that it's really pathology focused. In my sex ed at school, I was very much inclusive of all the LGBTI. I was inclusive of the importance of respecting women who chose to become mothers at an early age, that we don't judge someone by their age when they become a parent. I did include pleasure, but not with any kind of specifics or the kind of way I would be doing it now, with that sense of self-exploration. I certainly encourage people to masturbate. When I taught sex ed, I was certainly inclusive of consent to a certain level, but not anything like the extent that I would do it if I was doing it today. But one of the things that I mentioned then, and I would still mention, and I think it's not well enough known, is about arousal non-concordance. So I talked about sexual assault, acknowledged that was a thing, had resources for the local centre against sexual assault. But if you're being sexually assaulted and you become aroused, and maybe even some people orgasm during an assault, that does not mean consent. It does not mean you actually liked it or enjoyed it or wanted it. So there's a real confusion for some people who have been abused and thought, well, hang on, my body reacted in this way. Does that mean that I, in fact, was going along with it?
I guess that adds more stigma to their experience as well.
Yeah,
And shame.
And shame. It's all your fault. Yeah, and that's just to know that that's a thing. Our bodies, it's a stimulus response.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean your head wants it just because
it's a physical response. Yeah.
So if you had the opportunity to create a curriculum that, say, worked into a 5-week term, what sort of topics would you...
I'd really like to take it from a neutral perspective in relation to any of the heteronormativity or the LGBTIQA+. Start off with people as humans. I mean, you've got to include reproduction and making babies or choosing not to make babies. It'd be about self-knowledge and self-trust, skill building around communication and negotiation. There'd be a lot of resources made available, and these days there are some fantastic online resources, but you really need critical literacy. You really want to give the kind of sexuality education that means people aren't going to pornography to learn about sex.
That's what I was thinking too.
Because that's what a lot of young people.
Yeah, I was reading a study and they were talking about youth in America watching pornography for sexual education, and then not knowing actually, how babies are made, etc., and reproduction, because they were.
And also it gives a lot of false expectations of what sex is,
and
because
what bodies are.
Yeah, in the porn industry, obviously it's all for the cameras, and so they're playing up to very sometimes extreme roles in those positions and those experiences, and yet we know that in everyday intimacy it can be a lot less entertaining for everybody else to watch.
Yes. Yeah. And you don't see the negotiation and the consent. Or the preparation.
Yeah.
Justin Hancock, who's an English sexuality educator, has got some awesome resources, and his website is bishtraining.co, I think, or .com. And he's got a really good Planet Porn resource that's written for 14 and above. It's a series of situations and hand-drawn pictures, and it's this, you have to go, is this Planet Earth or Planet Porn? And on the back is written the actual where this what's
I
what do you
really
know?
like
Yeah, I
that.
do too.
Yeah,
That's
I'm going to
great.
check it out.
it's a really good resource. Often the trope around porn is that porn is terrible and it's all bad and it's degrading and exploitative, and it just that's a thing. But there's also ethical porn made by people who want to be there, who've really thought about being there, who might be queer. The thing with ethical porn is you have to pay for it, because that's part of the ethics, is that the performers get paid, all the people involved get paid.
How do you create this education resource for quite a range of maturity levels?
Let me reassure you, Zara, that the more sexuality education, rather than encouraging people to start something they're not ready for, actually the research shows really clearly that the better sexuality education you have, the more likely you are to delay your sexual debut. So until you're ready.
What's going to set, I guess, young people up for healthy sex education is where, schools need to focus on.
Yeah.
Communication, a good understanding of consent, access to resources, critical media literacy, that should apply across the board anyway, but critical media literacy, to have comprehensive sexuality education, I think. So you don't just have the maths talk and then you're done for maths, you'll work it out as you go along. Sexuality and age appropriate, you mentioned that before, age appropriate sexuality education starts from birth, in how you handle a baby and how you well, like if you say, I'm going to change your nappy now, you don't, it's not like a kid goes, yeah, I don't want it changed, or squawks, that you just leave them in a dirty nappy. You just go, I'm going to change it now, is that okay? And there's a space. But the expectation is that there's actually a space there for them to have a response. And so when they're older and they're able to communicate more effectively, do you want to give grandma a cuddle? No. So okay, just thanks. Look, would you rather high five or wave, or maybe later if you'd like to give grandma a cuddle, maybe you can do it then. So that the child has that body autonomy, and the expectation isn't that because this person who's older in a position of authority wants to cuddle your body, they get to do what they like with your body.
Which is amazing, because that's also strengthening the language around consent too. No,
Absolutely.
I don't want to cuddle.
Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
That's great.
And if they have their no respected, then they learn that feels good, and that gives them that confidence. Another really important thing that I think should be in this school sex ed course is about understanding your emotions and managing emotions effectively.
And I can imagine that if we're teaching young people that, it would help to break down the stigma around people not expressing their feelings, especially cis men, expressing their feelings and showing emotions.
What are the benefits of having early LGBTI and sexual health education in schools? What can that lead to?
Well, it leads to people being okay with who they are. It leads to normalising that normal is bullshit. I should have worn that button too. Normalising that normal is bullshit, and accepting people for who they are, and supporting them to explore and discover who they are and be safe in that context. So the benefits of that mean you have people whose mental health is better, who are far less likely to be having suicidal ideation or attempts, all of that. So it's fundamental for the well-being of everybody in society to make sure that the amazing diversity of our society is just out there and learned about and shared and talked about.
Where's a good resource that we can direct people to?
First up, particularly for young people, scarleteen.com. Fantastic, very queer friendly, and doesn't talk down to people. It's comprehensive and has really good information. I'm a total fangirl for the work of Meg John Barker, who wrote Rewriting the Rules, and I absolutely recommend Rewriting the Rules, and any of the other books that MJ has written, particularly those with Alexi and Taffy around gender and queerness. The basic principle, that the thesis that Meg John Barker writes about, is that you are totally okay as you are. There is nothing wrong with you. But it's the system that expects you to fit into this box that is the problem.
Yeah.
So you're perfect as you are.
Yeah. So Linda, can you give us your top 5 takeaways that we think the LGBTI community should know around sexual health and education?
You're perfect and you're loved. find really good resources that validate who you are and inform you in really helpful ways. Know who you are. Know what you want. Be prepared to ask for what you want. Be able to call a boundary or respect someone else's boundary.
Well, thank you for watching Speak Easy for LGBTI. Tune in next week for more community content, interviews, and our fabulous faces.
Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for extended episodes and like our Facebook page to show your love for Speak Easy and the LGBTI community.